Good evening. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. Welcome in the name of Marc, Angélil and myself and our teams to the final installment in this semester of the sessions of Territory, Urbanism and the Anthropocene. I would like to thank for their help in realizing this series, Sascha Deltz and Hans Hortig and Jörg Stovins behind the camera. Sascha and Hans will join us afterwards in the discussion as well. I have to send you regards and excuse Marc Angélil, who is unfortunately ill today with the flu, like many of us, and Marc actually prepared the introduction and wanted to say a few words today, and I will read those words for him. So, to start with a little look back on this semester, we began in the end of September with the guest lecture by cooking sections on the agency of food production and its territorial impact. And now we are coming perhaps in some sort of a circle, ending with Sandra Bartoli's lecture on the production of nature in the urban context. We have initiated this series already last year. This is the third semester, and you remember that we had the first two cycles of this lecture series under the heading Urbanism Beyond Neoliberalism. So it is useful also to remember that there is a geography of terms, of concepts connecting these two semesters. And we can foreground now the terms urbanism, neoliberalism, and ecology. And Marc sends a message that these terms, in his opinion, establish a tripolar diagram foregrounding the interrelation of what has been termed the Urbicene, the Capitalocene, and the Anthropocene. Marc writes further, the sessions on territory foregrounds the role of urbanization as the key driver of what has been called the Anthropocene, the proposed name for the era of human-induced transformations of the environment. Considering that urbanized and natural environments are interwoven in deteriorating metabolic relationships, it might be more accurate to speak of what geographers have identified as Urbicene, to implicate urbanization and the urban as the primary site of anthropogenic climate change. But taking into consideration that urbanization is the prime expression of accelerated capitalist accumulation, other scholars have been prompted to recast our predicament with the concept of the Capitalocene. These three notions converge on the diagnosis that environmental ecology, urbanization processes, and globally integrated neoliberal markets, are locked in a symbiosis that is far from stable. So today we have a great honor to welcome Sandra Bartoli, and I would like to introduce Sandra with her book, Tiergarten, Landscape of Transgression. Sandra is a co-founder together with Sylvain Linden of Bureau for Constructivismus in Berlin, with the focus on what they call raw context, both found and constructed. An example of their work is a series entitled Architektur in Gebrauch, Architecture in Use, in which use is explored as an aesthetic category that informs the transformation of space. Their research focuses on the entanglement of nature in urban constellations, such as the Tiergarten in Berlin, an example of place production, offering new definitions of the urban under the challenges of what has been termed the Anthropocene. Their book, Tiergarten, Landscape of Transgression, this obscure object of desire, is co-edited with Jörg Stollmann and was recently released by Park Books. Sandra also collaborates on a research and exhibition project entitled Archaeologies of Sustainability. She has taught at several institutions, including the TU Berlin, and currently holds the Stiftungsprofessur for Visionary Forms of City, probably the most wonderful title for a professorship that I have heard, that is at Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna. And our respondent today is Tanja Herdt, who wrote this fascinating book, also recently published, entitled The City and the Architecture of Change, the Work and Radical Visions of Cedric Price. Tanja holds a doctoral degree from ETH Zurich under the guidance of Marc Angélil and is currently a member of the ETH Wohn Forum, which promotes new forms of urban sustainability, including also the production of nature within urbanization processes. So let us first welcome Sandra Bartoli, and let's begin with that interesting proposition, Tiergarten, Landscape of Transgression. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you, Milica, for this beautiful introduction. Yeah, that's very honored also to be here. And it's not the first time I'm here, but it's always a pleasure to be in this place and to see also what you're working on, all of you. Yeah. So, yeah, we can keep to the next slides. So I'm going to talk about the Tiergarten in Berlin. It's, you might know it, it's a very large park in the middle of the city. It is the oldest park in Berlin. At the same time, it is also an ancient forest, because it's been there for a long time, even before it turned into a park. It's 210 hectares, and it is a very peculiar place because it includes aspects of heritage, of urbanism, of daily use, of ecology, while at the same time it transgresses all these categories. So that's really the challenging part about this place. And it is, if you want, somehow you can also read it as an island of anomalies, in a way, that also is an expression of what is urban, of most urban, or a radical expression of what is urban in the city. So that's a bit the challenge that I'm bringing in to you today, because obviously it is a park. So one doesn't think of it as an urban, as a most the epitome of urbanism in a way. What is urban in the city? But I'm trying to sort of bring in evidences about this. It's not only because it is a place where humans and non-humans, so animals and plants and other entities coexist, but it is the place where human history together with natural history are constructed together. So that's quite a very rich place. I'm going to give just a brief introduction to the history of this place, because it's also, of course, like many parks in many different cities, it has a very rich history, but in this case, it is very specific. The way certain underlying logics within the history of this place define the place as it is today, of course, also in a very special way. So everything that happens in the city happens also in Tiergarten, and in a way Tiergarten is even more ancient than the city itself. In this case, you can see the city was here. Oops, sorry. That's always very sensitive, this thing. So the city is here, and outside, this is the Tiergarten as we know now. It used to be much larger, and it was a forest along actually a swamp forest along the glacial valley along the Spree. And this glacial valley goes from Warsaw to Berlin. So in this direction, of course. So it's a swamp forest along the Spree. It is flooded many times during the year. It is totally filled with vegetation and trees. And in around the 15th century, it is surrounded by a fence by the kurfürst, by the king, because of his desire of hunting. So it becomes a royal sort of hunting ground. In this case, this is there are earlier maps from the 15th century where you can only see the fence and nothing else. And in this case, I brought you a map from the 17th century because it shows the beginning of the building, the major roads, the major axes that go through the Tiergarten. In this case, this is the Straße Sinter der Juni, so in the middle of Berlin in a way, and reaching out towards the castle. So it was really just outside the royal house in a way, the Tiergarten for a place for pleasure, for hunting pleasure. The next one is 100 years later, so it's 18th century, where the park loses, or the forest loses its fence, and it becomes public. And in this case, because of the king, the royals lose interest in hunting somehow, becomes open to the general public, and the fence, of course, is taken away. What I want to point out to you is that it's still a forest, it's very, very dense, and here, following the Baroque manner, rooms, salons, and corridors are open up within this forest, this very, very thick forest. Still, it has the characteristics of this floodplain forest. As you can see here, it's still a place where water is coming in, reaching in, sometimes even reaching the street, the major axis here. I don't know, I'm not going to the author. It's not really about the landscape. The landscape architect in this case is Stanislav von Knobelsdorff, but that's just a detail. Later on, this is early 19th century. This is a plan by Peter Joseph Lenné. I'm showing it to you. He's sort of redesigning this place throughout 30 years. So he's been working on this area for a long, long time. And the manner is more the landscape, the English landscape park, or the picturesque park. So it's more open. It's an emulation of nature. But in this case, the material is the primeval material. It's still the forest. And what Lenné does, it just carves out spaces for clearings. He's draining the water or connected the Landwehr Canal because there is a very slow slope towards the Spree, just 2 meters, but it's enough to make these waterways running through it. So it's draining the water that is already there, make it into water streams, like features of a park. And there are bosquets, so small forests together, and groves together with clearing. So the forest is still present. It's still the original material. That's what's there. So it's always a construction of images from human culture, but they're projected using the natural material that is already present. This is an image that I really like because it's from the 18th century, and it's a picture. Sorry, that's not a picture. It's a painting by Daniel Chodowicki. I'm not sure if I pronounce it well, from 1780. I like to show it because it shows the approach. All these people with this fine clothes, the way they are enjoying this place in a very free, the posture they have is so relaxed. It's such a luscious place. It allows for a sensual approach and a sensual life in a way. So it's very pleasurable. This, just to tell you a story, was Alexander von Humboldt. He was 19 years old when he used to go regularly to the Tiergarten collecting mosses and lichens, and he was working for a botanist who was also a doctor, a physician, and he was collecting samples, and he writes in his letters to his friends how amazed he was by this place, and he feeling sort of the connection to what Leibniz was talking about, where you know, it's a metaphysic from Leibniz. I'm not going to explain this, obviously. But it's somehow the connection between entities, life entities, or entities altogether that belong to the world. And so the connection between plants, animals, and feeling at one with the entire thing. It's a beautiful excerpt from a letter from von Humboldt. That's to show you the difference to the 1904. This is a photograph, and this is a Sternale, and this is to show the opposite somehow what we saw before, how people had to sort of behave in front of this sort of controlled space that is still the Tiergarten. This is a Sternale, and it was filled with monuments. This is the Prussian craze, the self-celebratory craze. Putting monuments everywhere, as devices of celebration of military victories, of military or colonial desire, if you want. Yeah, that's just to show the richness of the history of this place and what kind of different kind of behaviors, different kind of approaches people had towards it, depending on the time. Yes, of course. So this is kind of a shocking image. It's by Hein Gorny, a photographer. He photographed the Tiergarten and the city right after the war. But it wasn't the war that that took down the Tiergarten. But instead, they were the cold years from 1946 and 1947, when the British Army gave permission to the people in Berlin to cut down all the trees, almost all the trees. 200,000 trees were cut down to produce firewood, because to survive. Of these 200,000, only 700 were left, and then during the years, right now, there are only about 100 of ancient trees. So this is it just cut short a bit the story. We are missing the Third Reich, when the alleys in the Tiergarten were widened, the streets, and also the Sternale, the big star where all the axes are connecting, also was widened from 50 meters to 250. And the victory column, the Siegessäule, was also taken from the Reichstag and put in the middle of this crossing. Because the intention was to use the Tiergarten for military parades. And that's an important aspect, because we will see it later also. So there are this is right after also the war, when the Tiergarten was also turned into a place of urban farming, but it's not urban farming as we know now. Of course, it was way more dramatic here. The people were really, making produce and in order to survive, and they were sleeping there during the night in order to protect their own allotment. That wasn't an idyllic. It's an idyllic picture, but it wasn't at all idyllic, as you can imagine. So I'd like to talk about two specific aspects that that sort of show the underlying logic of the place, that sort of gave form to the underlying logic of what the Tiergarten is today, and also make it special. So one first aspect is the replantation in the 50s, done by the new garden director, Willy Alverdes. This is somehow the 0 hour of Tiergarten, and this new director, Willy Alverdes, for him it was somehow a moment of zero history, because the only thing, or the only history he could refer to in order to design or plan the replantation of the park was to refer to natural history, and not referring to the military history, the Prussian time, the same. I mean, other reference of more recent history of Germany. So he was, he referred to somehow the geological history of the city, the glacial time, and he took inspiration from the study of the plant societies. That was relatively recent at that time, in the 50s. And there were very interesting study that where he sort of dealt with. And you know what plant communities or plant societies are? They're defined by one specific group of trees usually, but it's an interlacing of grasses, bushes, and trees. So it's a way that plants collaborate with each other in order to construct a biotope or an environment that is somehow sustainable, that is going to last. And somehow they cooperate, the plants. So there are specific plants depending on the quality of the soil, on the conditions of the climate, and they sort of hold together in order to make this environment last for a long time. So he looked at, tried to sort of reconstruct the Tiergarten, emulating these kind of plant societies, and he took specific studies about 6 different plant societies. 3 of them or 4 of them, they were original from the Brandenburg region. Some others he took in because he thought the more variety, the better for this place, because it's also about surprise and having different kind of biotopes or environments coexisting. Interesting that in the mind of Villar-Verdes, he didn't want to, he specifically wrote about that, he didn't want to reconstruct the park only for humans, for people, but he wanted to include plants and animals, that there would be a way to make them coexist somehow. And maybe the key is really in the plant society design scheme, if you want. And in this case, it's really a drawing by his department, by him. I mean, he was working in the park department. And interesting also because of the ideology of the time, he didn't reconstruct all the axes, all the alleys that you saw in the former plans, and the previous plans from the 18th century and 19th century. In this case, the clearings were allowed to be used by people. In the time of Linné, they were fenced in. Somehow there was a very small fence, but people were not really encouraged to walk on it. In this case, yes, that's quite the opposite. People were encouraged to walk on it. Another interesting device that he used was to not only to reconstruct the trails, regular trails for people, but to include very thin, tiny trails that would go through these thick woodlets. And because then only one person could go through them, and in a way the person would not disturb the animals, or wouldn't take too much space from the plants. And in a way, it's a way of overlapping the territories from different entities, from different beings. In this case, also it's a nice detail. It's the Rhododendron Grove. That's specifically, that's a new thing he introduced also in the Tiergarten. And you can see also these small niches that make the space so rich, and it is extremely spatial as a garden. So it's really, you have rooms within this very thick evergreen plants, which are the rhododendron. And this is a photograph taken from the place itself. Somehow very dense, very, very rich, and at the same time you can see it is a constructed place. So it is designed. It's been laid out with a certain intention, and then it just grew. And of course it's been maintained, etc., etc. But there is a design intention at the beginning. So I'm just saying it's not just about letting nature grow wildly. It's also setting. If it is about replanting a new space, it is setting out the layout or the rules that this place is going to develop within. Of course, the outcome is unforeseen. It is unpredictable somehow, but it's very special. Yeah, it is a very special aspect because it's also working with time and processes and open processes. Well, okay, that's a bit abstract at the moment. So the first thing is the Plant Societies by Alverdes. I should say also, maybe to go back to the previous pictures, that he wanted the Tiergarten to grow very quickly, so he also followed pragmatic rules from forestry. And together with the slow-growing plants, the oaks and the beeches, he also introduced plants that would grow very quickly. Because if you have poplars and birches which grow very quickly, you would establish the perfect sort of habitat for the slow-growing plants to grow undisturbed. They started planting, and just an example, they planted also oaks and beeches without the other trees, and they were burning because of the quality of the soil. It's very sandy, and the very hot summers. So you need somehow a sustaining environment, a structure from these fast-growing trees in order to sustain the slow-growing ones. The plan was done in the 50s. The plan was to cut down all the fast-growing trees after 30 years. This is the second element that shows the underlying logic of the Tiergarten as it is now, and this is the Biotope Map, an extraordinary document. The work was started in the 70s, if not in the late 60s, to do this plan, but it was published in 1984. This was the work. It was done in the TU Berlin, but it was also published through the Senate. So it was really like also a political plan. It was supported by the city. It wasn't just something, an experiment that was done within the university. It was really meant to be used for the future of Berlin, for the planning. In this case, it's West Berlin, as you can see, maybe. You have here, it's surrounded by a wall. And why the conditions for this plan to happen was, of course, the environmental movement in the 70s, very strong, that defined German cities. But at the same time, the other condition is the condition of the wall. The people living in West Berlin perceived all open areas as precious anomalies. And I like to quote Ernest Calbert, who says, he compares the population in Berlin to a reversed Robinson Crusoe, who's fencing in what can be saved for civilization, what he was able to save on the island, the wild island where he was living. In this case, the people felt compelled to encompass, to document the open areas within a map in order to cherish them, to protect them. And this was a will that wasn't only supported by the scientist or the ecologist or the naturalist, but also by the entire population of Berlin. So a very heightened sensitivity for the environment. And this is the birth of urban ecology, right here, in this place, under these conditions, under these political conditions. And so just to show you what was the condition? So it was a city that was still showing signs from after the war. So many empty places, a lot of fallow land, rubble everywhere, where you would see spontaneous vegetation growing. Because of the confinement of the wall, the ecologists and botanists started to focus on the city, but not only because of the confines of the wall, but because they found it very interesting. It was just living in the rainforest within the city. So it was very exciting, and there were very interesting plants growing here. This is just an example of a destroyed block, and you have the rubble there, but you also have all these plants growing spontaneously. And here in the former cellars of the houses, you have even gardens. People planted things for their own produce. This, because why? It wasn't only just weeds. Weeds were somehow redefined. They were not weeds anymore. They were interesting plants, but they were also very rare plants growing here, because of the seeds can last for a long time below the earth. So when the city was built very quickly during the Industrial Revolution, many seeds were sort of sunken in during the work. of the foundations of the house or making the cellars. And through the bombs, all these seeds surfaced. And suddenly there were plants that they were never seen before within the city. And this made it really interesting. And also seeds that came from, of course, the industrial time, from the transport of different goods, also from the train stations or from, through the trains and through the transport of goods. That's also a very interesting moment where you have a merging of exotic plants also growing within the city. So all this had to be mapped, had to be documented. And this is one person, a very important person. This is Herbert Sukop. That was back at the time. He became the founder of urban ecology and also the department at the TU Berlin. And he started this work that was at the intersection between the city and the city municipality and the scientist part, so the ecologist and the botanist. He's the one who started with the idea of the Biotope Map, which wasn't really an instrument they would have used, the botanists. Usually they would use charts and lists of plants for certain areas, but they wouldn't visualize it into a plan. They really, his intention was to make it into a planning instrument to convince politicians or to convince the city also to go in a certain direction for West Berlin. Anyway, he's still alive. He's very an interesting person, a very good person to talk to also, so he's still available. Wasn't in many cities you have this kind of phenomenon. This is a photograph from London, also after the war, and it's from another very important book, contemporary practically to this kind of work. It's by Richard Fitter, London's Natural History. A beautiful, poetic book that it's a collection of narratives about the city of London right after the war. And this is, he's also trying to write the history of London as a combination of natural and human history. Anyway, I also like to show this images also in London, and this is the richness of the places where they were able to find right after the war. In this case, Richard Fitter wrote a book in 1945, so very early, right after the Blitz, in a way. This is the foundation for the Biotope Map. This is a PhD work by Wolfram König, who was a student of Sukop, the founder of urban ecology, as I mentioned before, at the TU Berlin. Important work because he laid out the foundations in terms of, first of all, visualizing Berlin as an environment that is an environment for plants, and it's not just a city for human beings, but it's also it contains an extreme variety of vegetation. In order to make his work, to facilitate his work, he divided the city in 4 different sections. So he took everything. He took everything. The built environment, not only the open areas, he took everything in. And he, oops, sorry for this. Yeah. So he had you can see here geschlossene Bebauung, so it's the closed blocks, aufgelockerte Bebauung, so the sort of loosened building compounds. And then he has the innere Stadtrand, so the inner periphery in a way, and I can only interpret this as within the confines of the Berlin Wall. He would mean the open areas, or the open areas that were open because of the bombs. They were still there, and they were part of the inner core of the city. And then he had the outer periphery, but still within the confines of the walls. The outer periphery, as an example, includes the Grunewald. That's also famous forest in Berlin. And this is just I'm just showing you segments from the Biotope Map, which later on was developed on the work of Wolfram König. He also was involved, of course, in this work, showing you fragments of this because, in a way, it's just a political line, what you see here. the boundary is only political, but the biotope map could continue forever, ideally. It can go on and go on. There is no ending to the city. There is no ending to nature. This is what it means. And it's colored by hand, which is a beautiful thing in a way. And everything is included, the built areas. And this is another fragment from the edges. The built areas, in here, I show you here, this is the Tiergarten, very near the wall. This is the proximity to the wall. But these are very dense areas. As an example here in Schöneberg and in Kreuzberg, these are all very densely built areas. This is all biotopes with different kind of values, of course, different kind of meaning for the level of natural history. But it's, nevertheless, it is the perception or the understanding of the city as a natural space. Most importantly is that it is a plan, this map. It's not just a documentation. It is a propositional plan. It is a programmatic plan. And it contains, it's part of the Artenschutz program, Entwicklungs- und Maßnahmenprogramm. So it's a, Artenschutz program is the program for the protection of species within the city. And these are just guidelines. These are very short guidelines on the legend of the plan, but there are 2 thick books explaining very carefully what can be done on for each biotope, the city of biotopes. What can be done for each biotope in order to make it develop, in order to make it grow. So it's not just about protecting it, it's about a growing together of the city together with the natural world. I just bring you the example of the geschlossene Bebauung, which is the closed blocks, the closed building blocks, a place where you could think, okay, there is very little nature here. But their guidelines, they're very complex, and they don't not only talk about greening the roof or having green facades, they also encourage people to foster the life of animals in cellars and attics, and this means from bats to swift, the common swift, or from rats to mice. There is no judgment about the species. Everything is important. Everything is as a right to live within the city, and it's every part is part of a larger organism of the city. And this is just a sequence of from the legend, but the booklets are very dry. They're just guidelines and proposals, and they were done very quickly, and they were done also in a very courageous way. The proposals are very radical. It's kind of an interesting language they use. Yeah, that's. And if you want to get another perhaps interesting thing that about the biotopes, when they tried to name the biotopes, they started naming new places, new kind of biotopes, not only the park biotopes, so the graveyard biotopes, the cemetery biotopes. They would call it the Autobahn biotope, so the highway biotope, or they would have the industrial biotope. So everything was included. Everything was defined as a natural typology. And now we go back to the Tiergarten, because I have to explain to you the effect of the biotope map on the Tiergarten. This is a photograph from 1983, so it's about the time when the biotope map came out. And as you can see, this is Brandenburger Tor, this is Straße 7. Juni, this is Unter den Linden, and this is, of course, no man's land between the wall, the structure of the Berlin Wall. So very adjacent to the wall, the Tiergarten here. This is just the east section of Tiergarten. The biotope map had the effect to influence the population as well as the Senate, that they made it to a condition to the park department to slow down the cutting of the fast-growing trees. You remember forestry plan that was laid out by Alverdes. The fast-growing trees were supposed to be cut after 30 years. In this case, the cutting was slowed down. They could only cut if they received permission from the Senate. So they would make a proposal every year of how many trees they would cut. And then eventually they would come to the decision which one they could be cut. But the idea was, and it really comes from the environmental activism. It's the idea that this place could grow ideally into a rainforest or to come close to an idea of a rainforest. Nevertheless, it's not about pure wilderness, just growing freely. The layout of the plant societies within the Tiergarten make it are the precondition for the variety, for diversity of human hues, and also not only the human hues, but also the convergence of the natural history and human history together, that are constructed together. So you have a very rich structure that is the base for this place to be so diverse, spatially diverse. In this case, it's again one image from the Rhododendron Grove on this side during the winter. So it's very rich spatial condition. I'm going to start a series of episodes and telling you about episodes that make the Tiergarten what it is now, and there are bits and pieces and fragments, and also fragments of oral history if you want. But in a way, it's trying to sort of give you a picture of what this place is and why it is so fascinating. Die Entlastungsstraße, that's one of the first, perhaps, anecdote I'm going to tell you about. And it is about, well, first of all, Entlastungsstraße is a relief road, and it was part of was supposed to be the Westtangente, which is a huge plan, which was part of a very large plan for the Autobahn in Berlin. The Autobahn was a plan from the 60s and the 70s, where this sort of also a bit of a craze for infrastructure and to create new infrastructure within a city that is contained by a wall. There was the idea to have a fast connection that would go north-south, but then and one part of it would be the west tangent. This was part of the west tangent, and it runs through Tiergarten. This is, I'm sure you knew in this stage, because it's the last stage of this road, right after the tunnel that goes below the Tiergarten, which is also somehow part of this very old planning from the 60s. So this Entlastungsstraße relief road was going to be taken away, or demolished from Tiergarten, but it is, for the time of one summer, it's there, and it's empty of cars. People are walking in it, and it gives you somehow the scale of this area, of the Tiergarten itself. In the distance, you see the towers of Potsdamer Platz, and in the middle of the very wild, somehow lush forest. The scale of the road is not necessarily large, but you have a guardrail on the side, which means it was heavily trafficked. The speed was very, very fast, but it gives you, it's sort of a projection into the future, or some strange Logan's Run and Mad Max vision within the Tiergarten. So it's, in a way, it triggers kind of interesting speculations about this place. Another anecdote or episode I'd like to talk to you about is the Lenné triangle, the Lenné Dreieck, Lenné triangle here on the side. This is, again, the east side of Tiergarten, adjacent to the Berlin Wall, and this is no man's land, and this is the Tiergarten. Here we have the Reichstag, this is Brandenburg Tor. This land belonged to East Berlin while it was standing in West Berlin. So it was basically a place that had no jurisdiction. Somehow it grew neglected and wild, full of interesting plants. And for many years, it was in these strange conditions, being, without police, in a way. It was a place that belonged to nobody, in a way. For the planning of the Autobahn, this was supposed to be included within the new layout of the massive Autobahn that would go through the Tiergarten. And there was a group that was fighting against it, the anti-West tangent. It was a group also of activists, and there was a group of ecologists who were very interested about the future of this place. And in 1988, finally, West Berlin reached some sort of agreement with East Berlin to exchange land, because there were many different fragments along the wall that belonged to East Berlin but were in the west, and some other fragments that belonged to the west but were in the east. Because, of course, you simplify the wall, yeah? Because otherwise it becomes too expensive to make it in this way, yeah? That's obvious. So in 1988, they come almost to the agreement, and what happens at the right end, the group, just 2 dozen of people, they occupy the place. Soon after, within 2 months, there become 300 living here and camping here with goats and making gardens and tents and not letting go of this area. And this is somehow one of the few joyous stories about somehow about the Berlin Wall, because this is the only time when the police came then, and finally the exchange happened between the land, and finally this land became part of West Berlin. Then the police could run in and move out the people. And the people started climbing up the wall and moved to the east, which was the first time that this happened. And the police from the GDR are here to sort of gather them and take them. Apparently they took them for breakfast and then released them at Friedrichstrasse. So that's one of the few stories that we can have a smile about the Berlin Wall. And it is, in a way, this place, I show it to you because somehow the Tiergarten is a bit of an outlaw. It is a bit of a rogue place. It is sort of under the radar for such a long time. And this is a place that really signifies this kind of special state of Tiergarten. The zoo bunker, a huge structure that was designed by Speer, not far from Tiergarten. It's in the middle of the zoo, which is adjacent to Tiergarten. This place was supposed to shelter 15,000. Usually when the bombs were coming, 30,000 were able to fit in. It contained also the treasures of the Pergamon Museum. It had an hospital inside, and on top of it there is the anti-aircraft gun, the Flak Tower, as you probably know. This place, I'm showing you this and I explain later why. It's important. The story is, of course, that the concrete after the war was very difficult to demolish. The British Army took several attempts with dynamite in order to crack this place. While they were putting the dynamite and using dynamite on this structure, all the other structures in Tiergarten, because of shockwave, were destroyed, and this was still standing. So eventually cracked in half, and the rubble was taken away, and they built roads with that. But there was another tower nearby, the command tower, a little bit smaller than this one. And this was turned into an island in the middle of Tiergarten, in the middle of a lake that is in Tiergarten. And it's the only hill you can find in Tiergarten. Of course, Berlin is relatively flat. In this case, there is a strange hill there. And it's in the middle of the water, there is no connection to it. And it became automatically some sort of bird sanctuary. And a place that also where people fantasized, and I'm showing you some fantasies. People from Berlin, this is a group of artists that belong to the gallery of Ben Wagin, who is also an environmental activist, and he's also the founders of the Parliament of Trees in Berlin. two beautiful gardens of wild trees along the former death strip. Anyway, he had a gallery back then, and these are his artists, and they decided to occupy this island with a boat and to make sculptures on this island in order to save the trees, to protest against the cutting, the felling of the trees. An interesting detail, they would lay out rubber sheets along the trees in order to make the people aware of the existence minimum, the minimal space a tree needs in order to survive around the roots. So that's, this I found in the archives of Tiergarten, in the cellar. I mean, they have this beautiful, beautiful things there. Another is the group of the Albert Schweitzer group of friends, they call themselves. It was kind of a larger organization, and together when the daughter of Albert Schweitzer came to Berlin for a visit, they pulled together also the mayor of Berlin, and they decided to go on a boat on this island in order to plant it with oaks and to rename the island the Albert Schweitzer Garden. So that's another sort of appropriation or how these places really trigger imaginations within the population of Berlin or many different groups. This didn't happen because then the oaks saplings were eaten by the rabbits, and then so this was sort of the attempt didn't really work out, but nevertheless the interest was there. And so a different sequence of interest groups, but I take you here. This is a picture from the Fanmeile. I don't know if you know this. This is in the middle of Berlin, I mean, of course, in the middle of Tiergarten on the Strasse of the 17th Juni, there is what is called the Fanmeile when there is a world championship or European championship, then or many different kind of events. This space is used for mass events where really, truly, so literally millions of people come in to attend public viewings or of soccer games and then many other things. And there are many different kind of events happening here. And this is in the middle of Tiergarten again. This has a history also that started to develop, well, the first moment is of course the Third Reich when they widened the road of the 17th Juni for mass military parades. And this place became the ideal place that also triggered the imagination of many different people to occupy, to use it. One example is the anniversary of Berlin in 1987, 750 years of Berlin, where West Berlin and East Berlin compete for the scale of the events that happen in public space. And this space is used, I don't know, there are many different stories, and there was like a copy of Brandenburger Tor running as a wagon on this road. I mean, different details, but maybe the most famous one is one of the first love parades. We Are One Family, 1996, takes place here. That's the first time it takes place in the middle of Tiergarten, where 750,000 people participate. Next year, 1997, there are going to be 1.5 million. And that's when things scale explodes. And the city itself realizes about the potential of this area. And in a way, it is somehow a harbinger of the future of the understanding of public space in Berlin as a continuous surface for partying, for celebration, for hedonistic events. Well, the Fanmeile, I don't know if it is an hedonistic event. Anyway, it is very commercial, of course. But the fact is that the Tiergarten is occupied 120 days a year for mass events. And that's practically almost all the time, this means. So that's the proximity of the forest is obvious. So you have both scales are present simultaneously. Scale of the people, the scale of the vegetation, the natural world. Another harbinger of the future of Berlin, very near Tiergarten. Tiergarten is here, right after Brandenburger Tor. This is Pariser Platz the Plaza of Pariserplatz, before it even existed. It didn't exist at that time. That was 1994 in November, 24th November. Yeah. And there is MTV Europe Award, and here they set out a tent that occupies the plaza that is going to be. This is the actual shape of the plaza that we know now. If you cross Brandenburger Tor, you have here the Adlon Hotel, and you have the American Embassy on the side, the French Embassy on the other side. Everything is filled, and this is the size of the plaza. And this is kind of a bizarre moment because there are only 2,000 people are invited, VIP people, to enter this tent. Tom Jones is the host. Take that, win the best prize for the music, for a music band. And the detail is that it's the first time the Brandenburger Tor is used as a background stage and together with the Tiergarten, of course. So it's also a call of what, or the first idea of what the public space in Berlin is going to be. That's the way it's been treated. It's a kind of strange ghost, in a way, this image. There are only strange, glorious, heroic moments around Tiergarten. There are also other moments that are less heroic, but I also talk about a different kind of desire. These new villas, which were built after the reunification of Berlin, are in the proximity of Tiergarten on an area that was supposed to be become an extension of Tiergarten. This is the former area where the embassies were supposed to be built during the Third Reich, during that time. During the Third Reich, we have a series of buildings of embassies, the Italian embassy, the Japanese embassy, and the Spanish embassies. Those are the allies. So those are the first that are built. The others were not built. And this area was sort of stayed empty for a while. It was full of vegetation, full of wild trees. Supposed to become part of the Tiergarten. Right after unification, it becomes, even though it is public, it is sold, and it's given away to a certain idea of a future of the city that is based on sort of neoclassic standards, or not standards, but aesthetics. And these, of course, are luxurious villas, and you can see, I don't know, a little temple on top of it. The street is designed so that it's not supposed to be for cars, but of course cars have to be accommodated, even though within a neoclassic aesthetics. So you have these niches where cars can be placed and hidden away between the trees, but nevertheless, there are enough places for the cars. Also, the garage on the ground is not big enough, so cars are parking on second row. So in a way, it is a bit of an ironic image, what I'm showing you here. These places, like others around Tiergarten, put a pressure on the garden, on the Tiergarten, because it is an untamed place, because it is wild, because it is thick, and because many different kind of uses can happen here. But these kind of areas put the pressure for the Tiergarten to be more controlled, to be more transparent, to be more accessible, so this sort of there is a pressure to make it change, and that's also the reason why I started doing this research in 2013. Very different from the images I showed you before. This is the work by a very interesting botanist, Maria Sophie Rohner, who in 2006 did a survey of Tiergarten and discovered that it was extremely rich in plant species. This is just a chart, a regular chart of a botanist, where you have just she takes a section of certain sampling. She takes samples from certain areas within the Tiergarten, and then starts counting the plants and identifying them, and then figuring out the level of the biotope she's documenting. In this case, 2006, there is on the, I'm missing a bit another aspect, but she's finding the Tiergarten has been extremely rich and a very valuable biotope. After 2006, there are many different trails are sort of reconstructed, or some of them are even invented as belonging to the time of the Baroque. So there is this, as I said, from the pictures comes, there is the pressure also to reconstruct historical elements within the garden and taming the wilderness. And this was a document that was, she did a survey in 2006, then she did a survey in 2011, and this, what she was saying is that there was the plant communities, or the richness of the plant communities was depending on a level of neglect, of forgetfulness, from the point of view of the gardeners. So it was a logic of lawnmower, wherever the lawnmower goes, and maybe forget some parts, maybe some things are going to grow more wild, more biodiverse. So that was a beautiful way that she expressed this kind of also concern about the reconstruction of many different Baroque elements that took away this, they started to control the sudden wilderness that was part of Tiergarten. This is not in Tiergarten, this is on the Peacock Island, and it's a hunting lodge. The Peacock Island is somehow a counterpart, not a counterpart, but it's somehow, I see it always as a sibling of Tiergarten. It is an island further away towards the west and in direction of Potsdam, and it has so many common things with Tiergarten somehow. But this image I want to show you represents the shape-shifting qualities of Tiergarten. The hunting lodge is covered with oak bark in order to be almost invisible within a wild environment. At the first time, the first intention was to be used for hunting, so you have these loopholes where the rifles could be put through, where they could then, from that part, from that space, they could hunt the wild outside. Later on, when this island was turned into a zoo, because the king was, during his, he would collect exotic animals from ostriches to leopards to peacocks, of course, which are still there on this island. Then these loopholes were used to observe the animals without being noticed. And yeah, it is a bit about the shape-shifting qualities of the Tiergarten. It is somehow a symbol, at least I see it, for this place. This is about the scale of Tiergarten, and it is a goshawk, Habicht in German. It is a bird of prey. Many of them are, you can find them in the city, you can see them on your terrace, because you have a place of the scale of Tiergarten in the middle of the city. And in a way, it is, the Tiergarten it has almost an incommensurable. It is so large that it is difficult to be contained within a human measurement, just from the point of view of the pedestrian scale, of course. But it is a place that resists the horizon of civilization or urbanization, while, of course, containing many aspects of what is urban. But yeah, it allows for so many wild animals to be able to live in the city. This photograph is about the Russo Island. I'm almost done. I hope I'm okay with the time. The Russo Island is also a fascinating place, and this is the picture of after the cutting. Jean-Jacques Rousseau died on Armenonville, a beautiful garden in the proximity of Paris. Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher, who also wrote extensively about nature and the importance of nature. And he was buried on an island in the Rousseau, in Hermenonville. And this became somehow this island with this projection of this tomb of this very important philosopher who spoke so much about nature. It became a topos, a recurrent element, a recurrent topology all throughout the gardens in Europe. And there was one also in Tiergarten. In this case, before 1987, this became full of trees. This was a tiny island that contained at least 50 trees. This is from the recount of the former chief gardener, Christoph Schaaf. And he was telling that he loved this place. It was so wild and so strange. And so many birds were nesting there. There were swans' nest and all kind of animals were sort of lingering on this place. Because of the anniversary, 750 years anniversary of Berlin, they decided they needed to be cleaned out. I mean, cannot be. So they left 2 of the trees and they put a column in the middle representing the Rousseau tomb. You can imagine what Rousseau would have preferred. But this is an image that shows you that sometimes it's not wanting to see a place as it is, in the value of the place as it is, and projecting a different image, an historical image, or a prefabricated image on top of something that is there and you don't want to see. So this is it's a criticism towards the municipality in this case for their decision, or the people who were dealing with this place at that time. The chief gardener was heartbroken, of course, after that. Also in the 80s, that's the same time, 1987, this is a Prussian monument for Richard Wagner, of course, musician, you know it very well. Because of at that time, there was a zeitgeist, there was the fear of acid rain. Acid rain that was destroying the forest. In this case, they decided to place this very large canopy, this large roof on top of the sculpture in order to protect it from the acid rain, while, of course, the most suffering part was left out, which is the forest. It's still there. Right now, they even put very large lights that are sort of projecting light throughout the night on this sculpture. There are several video cameras, because are often graffitis protesting against this sculpture. One of the few ancient trees, at least 600 years old, they're still there in Tiergarten. You see the scale of it. It's almost, quite incredible. It's an oak. This is not Tiergarten, but I like to use this photograph because it talks about hedonism and Tiergarten, the relationship between this park and hedonism and pleasure. A man donated a very large amount of money to the municipality at one condition, that they would build a public shower near the Lion Bridge. The Lion Bridge is one of the iconic places that are in the proximity of the gay cruising area, which is a 100 years old tradition within Tiergarten. Between the gay cruising area, then there is the Lion Bridge. On the side, there is also what is called the Fleischwiese, which is the naturist meadow, so where people sunbathe naked. And in a way, on the shirt, you eat oysters, love longer. That's why I bring it here. But it is in a way that the understanding of this natural space as a place for pleasure, in the embrace of the leaf, in the embrace of the trees, also because it allows for many for concealment, for secrecy, and in the same time it's utterly public. This is a photograph that talks about the primitive hut. It's not taken in Tiergarten again, but in a way, it is also the inspiration of Tiergarten in the possibility for a strange future to be sharing the space with the roots of a tree. So that's a different kind of interpretation of the primitive hut as we know it, as an archetype for architecture. And one of the last episodes is picnic. This is a woman, she comes here when it's sunny every day. In Tiergarten, she has her revier, her territory, and she places her bike right here. And she comes here and she does exercises and she reads and she lingers there all day until the sun goes down. And that's really about how generous it is, this place. It's also the notion of a picnic. When you go into a place, you're not invited, but it's still there and free to be used. You can linger there for a while. Nobody's going to send you away. You're always invited. You're always welcome. In a way, I like to make always a parallel to the book by the Boris and Arkady Strugatsky, Roadside Picnic. It's a science fiction book. But at the end, there is a sentence that is really beautiful and for me relates so well to Tiergarten, that there is enough for everybody. There is enough place and enough territory and enough joy for everybody to be here and to linger here. So that's one of the last. And I like to close with a couple of questions. These questions were also asked during a symposium we organized in 2015, and it's about taking the 4 categories that are present in Tiergarten and simultaneously are transgressed. So the first category would be heritage. In this case, this is a reconstructed bassin. It wasn't like this. After the war, it was like sort of like a form, sort of a free form, organic form pond that was here. It was full of flowers, full of plants. And that's the moment when they decided to project an image that wasn't there anymore and force it to this place. But the question that I'm going to ask is that we know that Tiergarten is ancient, and at the same time, it is very young because it's been replanted only 68 years ago. So perhaps the true authenticity and a true heritage of this place is the possibility that all history can be projected into this. Well, there is the beaver right now. It came in just some 5 years ago. So, Tiergarten also raises just the challenge of the juxtaposition of high biodiversity, intense use, and heritage, and it really happens at almost a science fiction level. And it's again, I like to take in Skalbert quotation that talks about, I mean, he doesn't talk about Tiergarten, but I'm reflecting it on Tiergarten, because Tiergarten can offer an account of the city in which the human and the non-human, the social sphere, are created together, are mutually dependent. So it is somehow an expanded notion of ecology, where you don't only have a protected area, it is there for everybody, and its special spatial conditions allow for this to happen. So it's really architecture in this case. It's not just about fencing in a place and letting it grow. It is the interlacing of the plant societies and the wilderness that allow for this diverse use to happen. And the next step would be transgressing urbanism. Tiergarten is not divided into functional areas. There is no zoning here, but it is far from being a terrain vague, sort of a place that is sort of only of emptiness, a place that is not defined. It is richly constructed, as I try to stress here, and beautifully wild. And it doesn't only fulfill the most extreme dream of what is urban here, because It allows the 100-year-old gay cruising areas together with a naturist area, and it allows for accommodates the homeless back lady, the jogger nudist, the spunker sometimes, the naturist. But also because it includes the falcon, the hawk, the goshawk, the owl, the badger, the beaver. And it's, in terms of the vast transgression it produces, is Tiergarten the only place where the true urban life is possible? So it's also a redefinition of what is urban life, including all these species. Coming to the biotope map. The biotope map could be an inspiration for a map of neglect within the city. And I'm not talking about places we just forget about, but just places that are taking care, but a very intelligent level of maintenance, allowing for the most rich biotopes to happen, also in the most smallest cracks in the paving on the ground. It's referring to Gilles Clement. Probably maybe if you read the article I sent, he talks about this, and he talks about these tiny places of wilderness within the city as a repository of the future of life, as a repository of biodiversity, of the richness of life. And the last, it's transgressing humanism, so coming back to the question of the Anthropocene. As I said, this is a strange tree, and I like to take it as an example because it's so deformed by the war. I think it was hit by bombs, and it was shot, I don't know, in some bits and pieces, in places, but it was growing, and it grew in a strange way. It's a strange monster. It's also a beautiful monster, if you want. And he talks about the critical mass that it is Tiergarten, because it's so large and it is incommensurable. And the scale of biomass and vegetation density establish an autonomy that is very, very important and very key to this place, and which becomes powerful. It becomes really an agent within the city, Tiergarten itself. And Tiergarten does not only dissolve the alleged antagonism between city and nature, but in the logic consequences, or somehow what maybe my own, what I think logic should be, consequences of the Anthropocene. It is a model that conceives human and non-human creatures equal and mutually dependent. And the question is, Tiergarten is ultimately post-human. The question is, when does a human constructed place go beyond the human, and how necessary is this transgression? And yeah, this is the end of the talk.
Thank you, Sandra, for this wonderful talk, and also beautifully illustrated. And I think we are all kind of under the spell of Tiergarten.
Okay, I hope so. Wait, okay, now at your level.
Is here. Hans, do you want to join us also with the chair? So, welcome, Tanja. Okay, so you owe us a couple of questions afterwards. I really enjoyed the lecture, and also the photographs, and I have been wondering while you spoke about your motivation to embark on this project.
Oh, yeah.
So let's say, as an architect, you know, you step back and you go to the side of landscape and you take a different view. So how could you explain about that, right? So why did you feel you needed that perspective? I guess that you needed the other perspective in order to understand architecture also better, right?
Well,
how would you explain it? Yes.
Well, to say I'm also a trained landscape architect, so that's
yeah. Great. No,
But at the same time, it was really out of frustration mostly because I live in the proximity of Tiergarten, and I've been experiencing it for now over 20 years, and I've seen changes, and I was fascinated because I never really understood it. It was so you lose orientation there very easily. It's really not transparent. It's so thick and shady and strange. And this strangeness started fascinating me. But then I noticed that since 2006 or 2007, they started modifying this place. And not in a good way, and not in a good way in terms of going against this strangeness. And then I started thinking about, okay, what is this place? Why is it so different than any other park that I know? And then I started researching it, and I discovered that it is the biodiversity is way higher than in Central Park or any other park, in any other city park, if you want, in Europe. And then I noticed the different kind of uses, and that the people felt so free in this place. So it's mostly out of anger that I started to look into because of the changes. Yeah, that's and
right, But as I feel from your story, there is a kind of a paradigmatic position also being developed through the kind of close observation of the Tiergarten. Yeah. So you say ultimately, and I wrote down your statement as your question, is Tiergarten the only place where urban life is possible? Yeah. Right? So this is in fact the kind of opening up a new paradigm on looking at the quality of urbanity, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that was.
We will be discussing this question.
Yeah. No, you're right. That's a very. It's a very important. It's a key point. Also, and this, first of all, it was just an intuition in a way, looking at this place. But then I started teaching seminars and discovering this place with my students, and this was the outcome, that we realized that it offered so much more, the possibility of the proximity of different kind of uses, a different interpretation would not happen in a regular plaza, not even in Berlin. But it allowed for so many different interpretation of the space. And then we started asking ourselves, okay, it's not a fallow land, it's not just undefined, it's very well defined. It's spatial. Why? Why is this happening? So this is an ongoing research. It's not really, it didn't end yet. But yeah, it helps redefining the city and rethinking the city from this point of view. And that's a very important question.
Absolutely, because this the kind of understanding of the city as the biotope, the mixing of the human and the non-human, the kind of non-zoning approach, the diversity, right? The diversity as a value are all kind of wonderful qualities that we strive for, right? And so it's really a powerful model for a new kind of urbanity.
I really liked the lecture, and I was thinking from my ecological perspective, let's say. And from my work, I'm working on the idea of a social ecology. So what is culture? What is the human doing to ecology within the city? And you're coming from the very different perspective on how to think ecology as a sort of hybrid maybe of nature and culture. And as far as I understood your lecture, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Tiergarten for you is an example to display the very various sorts of interpretation, right, of what is nature and what is culture, and how the Tiergarten is going to be cultivated or interpreted by man. From the very beginning, where you see, and I like that picture very much, the old Berlin Festung, so the Festungsstadt, and the vast nature around it, like the open, vast landscape, and then the sort of cultivated Tiergarten as a sort of extension of the sort of Hofrituale or the culture of court, let's say. And then I was thinking, okay, and then comes Linné, and then come, so different sorts of how to interpret it and how to order it, and how to master it, let's say, by man in different ways, like more order, less order, more freedom, less freedom, total destruction and disaster hits. And then I was thinking, okay, and now comes the conservationist approach of ecology. And I was like, what's happening now? But it makes totally sense from the perspective of that closed system. The 1960s were all about closed systems. And West Berlin is a closed system in itself because it has, like, it was walled, right?
Yeah.
So everything you had was inside those walls. And of course then you had to see the relation between what was left in terms of nature and what was there in terms of human culture, and that has to be negotiated. So that made kind of sense, and there was that big shift from the tiny city and the vast landscape to the totally contained landscape within that wall of the city. So, okay, as far, totally interesting, I could follow, but then I thought, okay, now, this is the Anthropocene, right? So we've eaten up the planet, basically. Yeah. And now we have the situation, like the Berlin Wall situation on a planetary scale, let's put it like this. Maybe. Probably. Or maybe in urbanism, this is what we are thinking about, how to actually get the balance, right? And then you claim for the neglect, and then you claim for the unused, and the wilderness comes into, which is a kind of romantic idea, right? The wilderness. And I was thinking, what is the definition of unused and neglect? And I was thinking, okay, this is more thought about culture than about landscape, and correct me please if I'm wrong. So if you unuse something, then it's getting open, maybe for another use next time or something. So it's a sort of informality that opens up by nature that otherwise would be totally left out. And this would be the very interesting thing for me to ask you, what is the unused and what could be the map of the unused, and who's deciding about who's defining what is going to be wild and what's not going to be wild? This is my biggest question, actually.
Okay, that's
a lot. I'm sorry.
That's a lot. No, maybe I should have added, in terms of this map of neglect, maybe it's a map of loving neglect, but because there is still a level of maintenance, but it is to a degree that allows for other species to take over and to have them to allow for a right to this territory. And on a very maybe trivial scale, you could just think about maintenance, the maintenance of open green areas within the city. And many different cities that deal with this in a very different way. But it's just daring for the unexpected to happen, perhaps from the point of view of the municipality. That's something that maybe the map on neglect is addressing, that map on loving neglect. And then if you take it, I mean, that's the trivial, just the treatment of the open areas, just in terms of regular maintenance. But then you can also extend it. You can also go towards the buildings and the builds, the high-rise or the different kind of scale of architecture, because it's all architecture if you want. And then you deal with maybe other elements of perhaps the notion of decay, the notion of letting go things, the notion of aging, the notion of process within architecture, not holding everything tight and in order to survive forever, because that's impossible. That's just and maybe accepting these kind of processes, and that's a very interesting challenge to look at the city, and maybe that would be a different level of map of neglect, but loving neglect. Regarding who's designing that, I think everybody. I mean, we need all the intelligence of the people in order to counter or to face the changes that we're going to see in the Anthropocene. I think we need all our intelligence, everybody's.
One short question comes into my mind. I'm usually doing urban design plans or schemes, or maybe even zoning or planning schemes, and what I encounter many times is that we have the tendency to universally planning everything. So in Europe, everything is highly rigid in terms of predefined, and there's not much space for people living at one place to actually take part spontaneously or not so spontaneously in their environment. And to me, that Tiergarten, or that idea of the open, informal space, the soft space, is actually, I was thinking about, this is the place where this could happen. Our large desire for an informal space where we actually could be ourselves, or could let it happen, whatever it is, which is not really regulated very highly, but I think Tiergarten is highly regulated. Well, no barbecuing here, and
no barbecues.
Yeah,
that's
but could be the ideal. The utopian place could be a sort of freer space and not highly regulated. Yeah. And this, to me, is a very interesting idea, maybe even for planning or for zoning, to even leave out empty spaces or free spaces for interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely. That's just. I wanted to add something to that, because you need a shift in our understanding of aesthetics of open areas or green areas within the city. That's also something that maybe I should have added to the other question. Maybe that's really where everybody's understanding of public space is. Should be challenged, perhaps. That's also something that the Tiergarten suggests. Also, in terms of on many different levels. Yeah, that's maybe I didn't. It's not. It's just a comment. Just adding to your. Yeah.
Yes. Also, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting to see. Your perspective and your story about the Tiergarten, and I would also like to come back to this notion that you said, or your proposition, if this is the place to basically live the urban life. To me, looking at your presentation, it was almost is the Tiergarten as a way to understand urban life. It's not just living, but kind of seeing processes and elements that I think, particularly in the Berlin case, are often forgotten about what the urban is. For example, for me, it was fascinating, these life and death questions. You know, when the story about the bombs that generated brought old seeds to the foreground, and of course, when they grew, they didn't grow the way they did maybe 100 years ago, but there was a new kind of environment. It created something new, right? Or this kind of change of life and death in the case of perception with this bark tree house, where you have the holes to kill animals. They transform into holes to look at it, to understand nature. And I was wondering whether, because this also shows this kind of big diversity and different way of looking at the city, opposed to maybe I exaggerate a little bit, but also what you said, what your main motivation was to start it, to see some kind of trend starting to transform it that has a very kind of very clear, blunt vision of what the city is, and therefore also the nature is. And so I was wondering whether, do you see, and again, especially in the case of Berlin, where this revisionist kind of idea of the city is very strong, has been very strong, the city of stone. I mean, there was big debate, and the whole discussion about the Schloss. You know, I mean, I was wondering whether you see this as is this just another part of the diversity of the Tiergarten, or could you see it really as a threat to what, or do you see, or can the Tiergarten basically sustain this kind of, or just eat it up and be itself after that?
Well, that's a challenge that this place is facing at the moment. I mean, the edges are really putting pressure, not necessarily on the surface, because I don't think we are going to lose territories within or areas within the Tiergarten, but there is a pressure from a certain way of lifestyle that is put upon Tiergarten, as example, from the Brandenburger Tor and this Pariser Platz situation. There is a huge amount of control, and therefore a big chunk of Tiergarten is heavily controlled and heavily transformed in the past 9 years, I'd say. So it is a challenge for this place because I mean the scale of mass. That's what I was hoping for. That the resistance is because of the mass. The resistance is enough that it can stand on its own, and it's very difficult to change it in a radical way because you need to do major cutting, major felling. But what I'm more concerned, I think it's more the understanding of this place, to appreciate the appreciation. And I think the citizens truly appreciate the people, but the municipality doesn't really understand. It still is a bit of a threat because it is a sort of there is no definition where it's fitting in. It's not, so they always look at other example like Central Park or Hyde Park, and these are better. They're always taking it as Tiergarten is a monster, and it needs to be tamed. And that's mostly where these things can be changed. Of course, the municipality can change mind; they can see it, but they need to be taken up to sort of taken along to see it from a different point of view. Yeah, that's mostly what I'm afraid. And of course, in terms of the biotope map, we're losing areas, and we're losing more and more areas, free areas or areas where they were sort of neglected, forgotten, still lovingly maintained. Partially, there are some interesting, I didn't show pictures today of that, but I'm trying to sort of do a survey in Berlin of very interesting areas that are sort of very inspiring, spatially inspiring also, very wild. And we're losing those areas. That's something that that's the process at the moment of densification. That's quite.
So do you see part of resistance? I mean, is it, or who would have to do it? Is it something like with the Tempelhof where people kind of went against something that they didn't want to, or do you see the same kind of advocacy for the Tiergarten, or who has to, or do people like you who do this research? Are you kind of, you have to go? Do you have to go out and show this to people who maybe don't see this, understand this in a different way?
Yeah, I usually write nasty letters to the park department every time they do something. But yeah, I'm pretty sure people know about and appreciate this place. It's but it certainly is a movement that comes from the general public. You have to have this sort of awareness about your own city. You have to act. You have to be loud. I really think it's important because it belongs to us. That's basically it. It's not. I'm not really advocating for a bottom up or a top up, bottom down. That's it. I think it's a convergence of desires and awareness. I think. And as I said, everybody has to participate, or at least moved by the condition of the space within the city. I think that's something that is for everybody. I know very interesting initiatives, and people really achieved so much. And they achieved so much just by constantly writing letters, protesting, or even occupying some places in order to defend a certain level of nature that was understood within West Berlin, at least because of this tradition, which is not only a tradition of conservation, not necessarily. They had the choice to draft this biotope map from the point of view of Naturschutz, so protection, which is very strict, and the legislation is very, very hard. And they decided to work on the Landschaftsschutz. So it's a different kind of legislation. It's more loose, it's porous, it's permeable, and it allows for human use to adapt, and also for nature to adapt. So it's really a convergence. It's a more of a hybrid. They specifically decided not to be hardcore nature. That's sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
This I found very interesting, because then it's about the interrelation, right? Mm-hmm. It's about a space which is sort of for nature, but interpreted by people living there. Mm-hmm. And what I found the most interesting part of this lecture was, after having the knowledge of all the history of interpretations, seeing what sort of mirror these small spots in Tiergarten actually were for some people. So individual use and adaptation, how people reacted to those free spaces, let's put it like this, and the potential they saw in those spaces. And I think we do not have many of those areas in cities anymore that have the potential to be interpreted by many different people at the same time. So that sort of softness that nature or landscape spaces have for individual use. And this is something that struck me. So this is that adaptation and interaction that is possible on that scale, which is not possible in architecture so much, but much more in that sort of soft landscapey environment. And that I saw immediately a different map, actually, which is a map of the unused spaces that could be actually used as a sort of joker spaces or free spaces or recycled spaces for individual or groups or whoever to adapt. Let's say kids playing in those sort of unused areas. That happened very often when I was living in Berlin. Now they're all filled up by those fancy apartment houses, but maybe there are different runs. And so that potential for use actually is for me very interesting, because that builds up the relation to that sort of natural space that maybe you advocated in your images more.
I also advocate for architecture. I think structure is very important. Yeah, that's not only the freedom that undefined spaces or terrain vague. I'm advocating for the design, for the sort of laying out the structure. I talked so much about the planned society, planned communities, because they are typologies of landscapes and they're spatial. So that's...
but also the role of, to say so, human as a kind of a gardener, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. Some as a caretaker, right? Somebody
Absolutely.
who cares in a very conscious way about the kind of use, about letting go or about engaging, or the various uses that take place. I think this is a good moment to ask a question that intrigues me. To what extent we can understand the Tiergarten as a kind of a paradigm for urbanism, urban design? As a case which sets up a possible way of looking on other projects, right? On other areas, no? I think that because you spoke about the different scales in which landscape is interspersed, let's say, or mixes with the hard, surface or volume of a city. Is there I think I can try to ask this question in several ways. So let's say I think that there is a kind of interesting aspect in the idea of a limit, no? That there is a place in Berlin where through history, through a kind of historic interaction, there is a consciousness is developed that this space has a value. You know, just next to it there is maybe a site which is filled up with new buildings, but the buildings will not be built in the Tiergarten. Not just because of the law, right? Because there is really a consciousness, there is a kind of a protective aura of culture, literally, around that place, right? So I think that the choice to leave certain places out of the process of, as Marc would say, capitalist accumulation is a very important aspect in the Anthropocene, right? Where do we choose not to build, to let go, to let other values, I mean, and you contrasted it with those villas, right? The pressure of construction on the edge is rather high, right? And the pressure on the park is also evident, no? Yeah. So, nevertheless, a certain limit or a certain kind of resistance or a certain mutual interaction of the two forms of the landscape and the city has been established, right? And I think I could also ask it in a different way. There is also, I believe that the Anthropocene question is one of the issues that we ask ourselves is what is the value of nature, right? What is the value? And this is expressed even in this kind of very fashionable effort to calculate in monetary terms the kind of contribution of the so-called ecosystem services, right? I mean, I'm happier to see the examples like Tiergarten where we don't have to calculate. We are happy to convince ourselves, we kind of self-evident that there is a value, right? But I think that on a much larger, even on a planetary scale, we are facing those questions. No, what are the atmospheric commons? What are the maritime commons? What are what is the bottom line in terms of global biodiversity, right? Where are we going to draw the line? No, where are we going to in a way, release the pressure of the urbanization process and simply safeguard those areas because they are ultimately also resources for the future, right? And you have shown that very clearly. Tiergarten was cut down to the ground when they needed wood, and it was also, cultivated when the city needed food, right? So there is also kind of a productive or a resource aspect in those urban landscapes, and I know also that your work concerns the resource, let's say, metabolisms in the city. So I'm wondering perhaps on that more. On the level that kind of paradigmatically looks at the case for landscapes such as Tiergarten. I mean, can we extrapolate? Can we? How would you think of Tiergarten as a model for urbanism?
Oh God, yeah, that's if you're talking about. I mean, beside the fact that it's a radical expression of urban life, that's no. But it's interesting. You're referring to resources. I didn't show, as an example, one slide that there were scientists who dealt with the climate situation of Berlin in the 90s when they decided to build Potsdamer Platz. And they wanted to calculate, they did a calculation actually of the impact of Tiergarten within the city. And I noticed that the Tiergarten, because of its mass, its vegetation, the size of it, it draws the winds within the city, especially from the south. Because there is like a cone of empty land, or well, now it's became the Park and Gleisdreieck, another park. And it draws the winds that go through also Tempelhofer Feld, of course, but it cools the city beyond its own perimeter. So that's Tiergarten sometimes is even 7 degrees cooler than the rest of the city. So it has quite an impact in terms. It is it's interesting to see it from that point of view to calculate the value of a tree on a street, or how much it produces, what the oxygen and these kind of things. It's a bit of anthropocentric point of view. Of course, it's about how can I make use of the natural environment, because the natural environment, the planet, does its own work no matter what. I mean, it does its own production no matter what. We have and it's sort of totally independent from our own desires or wishes. But yeah, that's, I think, scale is a very important element, I think, also in urbanism in a large sense, in terms of resources and production of valuable elements such as oxygen, or cooling the air, or controlling or allowing for biodiversity. I mean, these are treasures that we need to keep for the future, because we're losing them. I mean, we're losing within all the scale of the planet. So scale is a very important aspect. I think it's interesting to think also in terms of fragments, but I think scale is something that we should think in the future. That's one aspect. I don't know,
I think it's very helpful. We should think about the scale. The landscapes in the cities should be large.
Yeah, and maybe to transcend the division then, to think, is the city, or is the city, can the city be nature, or is nature, or can the nature be city? And maybe transcend these formats or these typologies that we have, and rethink them, and the fact that the city can be a machine a construct producing resource instead of eating. That's how that's a relationship between countryside and city, as you probably know. So that's instead of switching the things, how can we construct a city that is producing, that is adding, bringing in resources, and in all scales. So recycle everything. Yeah, that's.
Okay, great. And after that, we can open.
I was just, as a comment maybe, again, about my impression of your presentation, is that you have, I think I saw 1 or 2 colored images.
Oh,
and the rest is black and white.
True. Only 1 and 2? Okay, so few.
So because for me it was very refreshing, and it has this very kind of weird quality of showing these diversities, but a commonality at the same time. Because if you show it in these black and white images, you suddenly it brings things together. So historical things are not so much apart anymore from the recent things, and so for me that was very powerful to show that it has this kind of common language, that everything is part of the same thing, more or less, without losing the diversity. Yeah. Which often with color images you have the flashy things, and if you talk about nature you expect, oh, now I'm going to see lush green stuff all the time, but it has this kind of abstraction of bringing things together. Yeah. So I don't know if it's a conscious decision.
It's conscious, It's also, I like to look at history as a different moment of our contemporary time. That's why I try to always take examples from history that can be very refreshing and strange. The way, if you look at history, you see, that's a bit a far stretch, but you think about the future, but if you could look, you imagine certain setting or perspectives. But if you look at history, sometimes you see examples that it can be as far out as things you can imagine for the future. And if you take them in as examples that could be part of our present or they could be part of our future, then it's really about how you deal with time, first of all. It's a very good observation. So how you show examples from the past that can be as updated, somehow to a certain present. And the other thing is that black and white photographs, especially of landscape or cities, I don't know, they reveal also the structure of the things. I don't know, for me, they're better in conveying the value of the space, the spatial also setting, and that's another element. So it's a very good point. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. I think it was very inspiring for us, for our education as designer. I'm a student of the MIS in urban design. It's about cities and migration. So my interest is, let's say, on the role of public parks as inclusive or maybe exclusive spaces for migrant communities, especially in European cities where I see that the public spaces, as for example, public squares, are very rigid and static. So I was wondering if you encountered during your research practices of appropriation of the parks by migrant communities or other groups?
Well, in terms of Tiergarten, yeah, there is also harvesting that is done, like picking of fruits that are, or there is all kind of understanding of interpretation of the space. There's some communities know about herbs and wild plants way more than, I don't know, other communities. So there is this kind of approach towards the garden that I've observed and I'm very curious about, because I also don't have this botanical knowledge of making food out of weeds. That's kind of a beautiful approach. So in terms of Tiergarten, it's very open. So it's really, you see all kind of different populations roaming the space and taking in and doing all kind of different things. So that's really a pleasure to see so much diversity there. And another example that maybe is, for me, a less positive example would be Park am Gleisdreieck, which is an extremely successful park. And it's been developed, it's been designed recently. It also was part of a large area that belonged to the German train company, the rail company. And then eventually they were sold, it was privatized, only in part privatized because there was an initiative, of course, that wanted to keep it as a park, because they sort of fought for 20 years in order to keep the park as a public park, to make it into a public park. And their advocacy was more for wilderness, to keep in wilderness, and eventually when it was, it's a very long story. Park am Gleisdreieck. Park am Gleisdreieck is extremely successful, but it's very heavily zoned. So certain groups can have, each little bit of the park is developed for certain groups to be used in a certain way. And if it's used in a different way, they come and they clean up and they erase the traces of this different use. So that's very strange. And yeah, it is very inclusive. At the same time, I find it very suspicious, this kind of treatment. So Tiergarten, structured space, but at the same time undefined in terms of imposing certain kind of views. I find it more open-minded, and yeah. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering about the aspect of a project in your presentation, and I saw the project in mapping. I saw a project in possibility of occupation or intervention. And then I also, I think I remember that you were also teaching and did a seminar on the Tiergarten. So I was wondering what you did with students and how, if students tried to show interventions or if you did mapping exercises and how that was organized. And then I'm also was thinking about remembering what your teaching experience is, and that you recently also started, or I don't know if you finished already, looking into the Prater in Vienna. So I'm wondering about possible similarities or complete difference, or is that a typology, or does that have nothing to do? Yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you for the question. I did surveying or cartographic exercises with my student in Berlin about the Tiergarten, because it was about, for me and for the student, to discover it together. Because I knew I had a little bit of knowledge, but that was really about knowing about the place as it is now. But the specific kind of cartography was to retrace or redraw a certain situation. So the situation, it wouldn't be a cartographic exercise about a certain layer of the garden. It would be about taking in many different aspects of it, in terms of human use, animal use, plant use, and often about the challenge of documenting a territory where the jurisdiction are overlapping throughout time. So different kind of uses happen, different kind of time a day. Sometimes they overlap from different kind of users. And I'm not talking only about humans, I'm also talking about non-humans or more than humans, you can also call them. I don't know, specifically I used, so there's sort of almost projects in itself, these cartographic drawings, mostly axonometric drawings, because they are objective and you can compare one to the next one, and at the same time there are tiny little design situations that were sort of taken out for our attention, extracted from the Tiergarten to our attention. So that was a bit the challenge with the students. So it was a combination of research and cartography understood as almost the design, even though. And for the Prater, I used the Prater, I decided to work on the Prater because it had so many parallel aspects to the Tiergarten. I couldn't do this with the Englische Garten in Munich, I'm afraid, even though it's a beautiful place. But I think the Prater it's much larger also. I think it's 3 times larger than Tiergarten. And it's, of course, the structure is very different. It has similar histories in terms of the felling after the war. There are many differences also in terms of, there is the Praterstern, which is very dense with use, and it's an amusement park if you want. It is a large plaza. It is a connection between the infrastructure, S-Bahn, U-Bahn, everything, trains. So, and then you have a gradual change towards a more natural space that is only apparently natural, but it is heavily controlled by the Danube regulation. I mean, the water levels are controlled, therefore the vegetation is depending on the water levels, controlled by machines, pumps, etc., etc. They were introduced after the river was almost canalized or controlled. I mean, it used to be a floodplain, a complete floodplain, all the entire Prater. So very interesting overlapping of technology and hard control by humans on an area that still looks almost natural and wild. And in terms of use, it's also very diverse. So that was very interesting. And the students, I used the same approach as for the Tiergarten. They started documenting the place and taking out what is special about this thing, what is outside the norm. And then out of that, they started developing a project, a proposal. And sometimes the proposal would be directed towards the entire city in terms of management of the open areas, as one example. And on the other side, they would just focus on the Prater in itself. And another thing about the Prater doesn't have an edge. That's why it's sort of crumbling. And that's where the development is sort of pushing in, and where Prater is losing ground. And yeah, that was also a question for the students, how to deal with that, how to cope with that. Yeah. Okay. Okay, sorry.
Yes. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I think it was really, really very interesting and very important also. I couldn't help but making a parallel to a very, very different, but at the same time very similar case, which is in Singapore, which is the cemetery called Bukit Brown, which has somehow drawn to itself a lot of separate interests in a very, very controlled and let's say restrictive socially environment where people, so it's a 1914 cemetery, Chinese cemetery, and it was closed in the 70s and since then kind of abandoned to itself, which is a very special thing because the Singaporean authorities are not known for letting places uncontrolled, and actually what happened is that it emerged as a kind of terrain for civil society to defend it. So you would have these overlaps of uses that Tanja was mentioning, where botanists were gathering there, history buff would go and look for graves, and then horse riders and dog walkers would also gather. It also has a memory of the topography of the island, which has been entirely leveled except for very few spaces, one of it being Bukit Brown, and also has, of course, a climatic benefit. So it has all of that, and somehow everyone who all of these groups who used it kind of got together at one moment and tried to stand against development, because of course it's threatened, clearly. Such spaces are, and I think this is also something interesting to look in parallel, but what it does is it has this function of being a political space, like a space where democracy can be exerted, which I find very interesting. In your case, it's perhaps not that the environment of Germany is oppressive, but somehow people were able to also use that space to let these various activities happen. So I'm just wondering if in these analogies there would be something to look at, which is to say, when there is a threat to a certain space, is there also a threat to democracy? So there would be something. I think it's not such a stretch, because I think that there is definitely a kind of there is something about the fact that these spaces are non-commercial very clearly. I mean, these spaces, there is not much money to be made currently on exploiting this space, which is the same with Bukit Brown. There's no money in it as itself. The money is the ground, basically. And as soon as these spaces are being kind of attacked or like being threatened to be developed, there is a kind of threat to democracy. So that would be my question for you. And then the second point would be, do you have a kind of project to turn this into a book, like to know, or I think like there is really an interest to find out, to document all of these things that are ongoing. But the book that the expert that we have is from an article, no? It's not from the book.
It's just, the book is a compilation of different contributions because of the symposium we organized in 2015. So, but they're very diverse. As diverse as the Tiergarten is, then the contributions don't always talk directly about the Tiergarten, they're just about aspects of it. What could continue, certainly, to collect all this. There isn't all these materials not collected in this book, just bits and pieces. So that would be certainly, I'm not going to stop here. I think that's, we'll keep going. But it's, the other question you asked is, I mean, that's a question you made into a statement practically. Yeah, I think certainly open areas that are open there, they're not necessarily there to, they're not commercialized or monetized in some ways, but they are really they're owned by everybody. and this is really anchored in the I think in the consciousness of all inhabitants in Berlin. I'm pretty sure. I don't know. Nobody really tried to attack Tiergarten in that way in terms of developing it. But of course, the example of Tempelhofer Feld was quite a striking, and the Senate is being traumatized since then. So they're really careful. Well, they're being more careful about including people, and it's certainly about democracy. And the picture of the Russo Island, like projecting an image of a place that is not there, not understanding what the play is, but just wanting to make it force it into another image, another perspective. That's something where the people started to react against. And it can be a form of imposed heritage, reconstruction. It can be a form of development, of course. It's about not wanting to understand what the value of the place is at that certain moment that makes people sort of react also. And it is a form of taking away, a good chunk of democratic, we call this agency. And so I think and these are the places that where people mostly react. It's a public space where absolutely those are where the rage happens. Yeah, but it's very. I don't know. I wasn't aware about this example in Singapore. That's quite interesting. Yeah.
I have a last question because when you described your further investigations into other places like the Prater or your studies with your students, it became clear to me that this is not an historical project of someone who is interested in history or of someone who's interested in the mapping of structures and zoning whatsoever, but in design, right? And so to me, I felt very much remembered of Cedric Price's project because he was trying to sort of develop an open architecture. And many of his projects are so minimal in articulation of architecture because he wanted to invite all people to decide how and what could it be used for, that it melts into a sort of landscapey project. It's something between minimal art and maybe landscaping as well. And it's also settled in a bigger territory, like generators settled in a wood plantation, actually in Florida, or some of this. And I remember they were studying the moments in time when the big pleasure gardens opened up in London. So, for example, Vauxhall Garden, that was actually displaying entertainments, but was opening up for public. It was not for the court anymore or for autocracy, but for all. So it was that mysterious search for something soft in architecture, something open and undecided, having to do with the bigger territory or sort of open approach for interpretation of territory, let's put it like this, or building and use. So, but on the other hand, you said, no, this is not only about wilderness and nature, this is about design, right?
Yes.
So, and this reminded me very much of it. So what is your idea on how to design such a place? So why is Tiergarten such a good example and, for example, Gleis Park not?
Well, it is setting out certain conditions and letting go. That's I think that's what Cedric Price is fascinating also because of the lightness and the softness of the elements that he introduces. It can be just a tiny form of infrastructure, or it can be connecting different places and then taking its course. And it's also a bit letting go. It means that it's become unpredictable, but there is a beauty and a richness in that because things add up then in that moment, and I think yeah, that would be certainly how I read the Tiergarten, even though it might not be perfect. I mean, I don't know. And in regard to Park and Gleisdreieck, yes, I'm mad at the zoning, at the maniacal way of control each little bit of that area. Even though I mean I enjoy seeing how people are taking it, but it's really only truly for people and not. Then nature would be sort of it's excluded, or it's just marginal. It's marginal in just small segments, or small woodlets that are still there. But yeah, in terms of the instruments, I think there are many different instruments you can use. But in terms of a landscape. Yeah, as I mentioned that so many times now, the plant societies are really a topology, and it's a spatial topology, and it's something that has been introduced and let go. And then, of course, there is maintenance, there is care, there is. But even if you look at buildings after they did a certain amount of life, you look at them and you see the transformation in them, and you can learn so much out of it when things are sort of, yeah, often architects maybe don't go back to see the things, but how they transform. But that's something that I'm keen about also, how the feedback loop between use and interpretation of space and the space in itself. And it's really a back and forth. That spatial structures or spatial definition has an effect on the individuum, and then therefore there's also an effect on the individuum and the space in itself. And it goes back and forth, and sometimes it can really, often, I think, has very beautiful outcomes. And that's, so I'm, yeah. It's Sandra Price is a master in that, but he's certainly, and as we already talked about it, I would have liked to see more of his projects realized. That would have been, but maybe the discussion, the discourse about the way you want to interpret space and one is a designer is more important, perhaps, for in the case of Sandra Price. I mean, that's.
So thank you very much. Thank you both. Thank you, Tanja, for this intervention. And I think especially the last point was very inspiring. Thank you, Sandra. I think it was also really inspiring last session in this series of 6 events under the title, under the heading of Anthropocene and Ecology, and perhaps the point that I will really take or think about is that Anthropocene requires from us ultimately destabilizing that centeredness of a human being in the nature, in the city. So perhaps what we learned from this lecture series, and especially from your presentation on the Tiergarten, is that we can imagine a more inclusive city. As you said, Tiergarten is perhaps the most urban space or the only urban space in Berlin, so that's a beautiful vision for the future. So indeed, could you tell once again your professorship is the visionary city?
Visionary forms of city. That was
visionary forms of cities. So there you go. Tiergarten is one of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for being here.
Thank you for having me. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.